Okay, let's get started. Welcome back. I actually don't have any announcements, so I'm just going to hand it over to the first authors. Dimitri Papanikolaou is going to talk about technology in the labor market. Take it away.
There you go. So, okay, thanks, great. This is joint work with Hubin, who's sitting right there, and Larry, and Brian, who couldn't make it today. So the question we're trying to ask in this paper is, what's the impact of technology improvements on labor demand? And this is an age-old question, and everyone is getting always anxious all the time whenever there's a big improvement. And that's actually a complicated question to answer, because new technologies can act either as a complement or a substitute for labor in narrowly defined tasks. Yet at the same time, even if the technology is substitute for labor in specific tasks, it can actually increase the labor demand for the occupation, either because they allow workers to reallocate their effort to other tasks, or because they raise the overall demand at, say, the industry level. And what we're going to try to do is to try to disentangle these forces in the data. Now, let's be very clear. I said this is the question we're going to be interested in. That's not the question we're going to be answering. That's a really hard question. Instead, we're going to answer the easier question of what's the impact of technologies on relative labor demand across different occupations. Okay, so everything we're going to do, there's going to be a missing intercept. So I'm not going to say anything about whether we're all going to be out of a job. At the very least, we can talk about, in relative terms, who are going to be the winners and losers in terms of jobs, not people. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use theoretically grounded measures of technology exposure at the occupation and decade level. And what we're going to do is we're going to first write down a model where there's a rich set of forces in interplay. And the model is going to tell us that if I'm focusing at the within industry demand for a specific occupation, there are two sufficient statistics that matter. The first is the occupation's mean task exposure to technology. So on average, what is the exposure of my tasks to technology? Like what can capital do that can substitute across all the things that I'm doing? But that's only the one of the two. A second force is going to be the extent to which this substitution of technology to task is concentrated to a few tasks that I'm doing, or is it uniform across the board? So for example, if I had an AI assistant who would automatically file my reimbursement receipts, that would free up time for me to spend more time on teaching. Okay. So our main finding has been that over the last century or so, technology has increased relative demand for occupations that tended to employ more educated workers, that tended to employ more women, and paid higher wages. Okay, so in that sense, technology has been skill biased over the last 100 years or so. Now, in the last part of the paper, we're going to speculate widely about the impact of AI on relative labor demand. And our point estimates suggest, again, there's a huge confidence interval here, that AI is going to largely reverse those trends. So it's going to favor jobs that employ more men, employ more blue-collar workers, and employ workers with lower levels of relative education. Okay, so the model is pretty complicated, so I'm just going to give you a brief bird's eye view. So it's a model where there are different CES nests, and I expect you to remember all those Greek letters up there. There's basically a top nest that aggregates industries to aggregate output. Occupations get aggregated at the industry level. Tasks get aggregated to the occupation. And at the very bottom layer, a task can be done both by labor and capital. These are imperfect substitutes. So a key parameter right there is nu, which is the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor at the task level. So in some sense, this is a model that takes the task-based framework of a semi-reverse repo and just adds more layers so we can take it to the data. So we can talk about industries, workers, occupations, et cetera. Now, what's going to be technological progress in this model is going to take two forms. The main one we're going to be focusing on is going to be capital deepening, declines in the quality-adjusted price of capital. Now, remember here, capital is going to be specific to a task. So what we're going to do is to allow the capital that is specific to tasks, the price to fall differentially across tasks. So those epsilons right there, that's going to be the measure of technology improvement. So if I have a software algorithm that does reimbursements for me, if it gets better, cheaper in quality adjusted terms, that's going to be manifesting as a large epsilon that is specific to that task. In addition, we're going to allow for improvements at the industry level through the arrival of new products. Okay, so that's going to be a standard term that's going to look a lot like a neutral TFP shock. Okay, now on labor supply, there's two dimensions. There's within job labor supply. So I'm going to have 24 hours in my day that I can allocate to different tasks. There's going to be decreasing returns to scale on each task, and that's going to be key for things that we're going to be measuring in a bit, okay? So I cannot just devote all my time in writing papers. I would love to, but I can't. And there's also going to be an across-job labor supply decision. And then we're going to take something off-the-shelf standard, and basically there's going to be a wage index at the occupation level, and there's going to be upward-sloping labor supply. And you can microfund this with different tricks that involve Fréchet distributions, et cetera. That's pretty nerdy, and we're going to skip that. OK, so here's what the model says. The model says that if I look at the labor demand for a particular job, and here a job is a combination of occupation and industry, it depends on a few things. So the first thing that it depends on is the average exposure of an occupation's task to technology. So remember, those epsilons are the shocks. J is a set of tasks that I do. So a sufficient statistic is, on average, the tasks that I'm doing, how much are they exposed to technology? And the coefficient there, that little eta, is basically a function of, it's a racehorse between the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, nu, and the elasticity of substitution across different occupations. That last term is a Baumol effect. Okay, so you can think as the occupation output gets cheaper, whether demand for that occupation's output goes up or down. And that's a racehorse between that and the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. So these two things matter. Now, if you think of it for labor-saving technology, nu should be a number that's much bigger than 1. Chi, I have no idea what it is. 1 is probably not a terrible assumption. Okay, there's, however, a second term. And that second term, think of it as a second-order correction, takes into account the fact that if the improvements in technology are uneven, workers can reallocate effort to less affected tasks. And it turns out that that term is positive, and the magnitude depends on beta, which is basically the decreasing returns to scale at the task level. So if beta is a small number, it's much easier to reallocate time across tasks. If beta is 1, then there's basically, I can't. And then in addition, there's some other term, which is a complicated function of the cross-task elasticity, which is technology improvements in task I, how much do they affect the prices of other tasks relative to that task? Okay, we don't need to get too much into the magnitudes, but notice that that term is squared, so the sign is always positive. Okay, so that second term can create an offsetting demand on labor demand. And in fact, there are parameter values that the second term can actually dominate. So here's an extreme example. 2 tasks. I fix the average technology shock the same. And then the only thing I'm choosing is how the technology is distributed between the different tasks. So if all the improvements happen in one task, see the green line, I can reallocate hours away from the affected task, reimbursements, towards the less affected task, research or teaching, and it can actually increase labor demand for the job, even though I am exposed to technology. So the punchline from this is that you're hearing all these things in the news about 80% of the occupations are going to be exposed to AI going forward. Okay, that may be true. That does not necessarily translate into declines in labor demand. Okay, and this is without talking at all about any spillovers at the industry. There's additional terms here, and this is this term that is a combination of 2 things. So on the one hand, technology can create new products. That's going to increase labor demand across the board. And there's an additional term where technology can basically lower the cost of production. And that second term is, again, a racehorse between 2 Baumol cost effects. which is the occupation output getting cheaper versus the industry output getting cheaper. How does this impact for the overall labor demand for that industry? Depends on the sign between these two forces. And there's a last term, which captures aggregate spillovers, which is really hard to deal with, so we're going to ignore it. Missing intercept problem. OK, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to, with a lot of assumptions, try to create empirical analogs of these objects in the data. So there's a lot of details in the data construction. We're going to use LLMs. We're going to use data on patents. We're going to use data on task descriptions. And we're going to start by estimating the distance in a textual sense between a patent and a task at a decade level. And then we're going to use those similarities, again, with a lot of assumptions, and create an equivalent of these average exposure and concentration of exposure in the data. And we're also going to try to measure the degree of technology spillovers by looking at the degree of patenting in an industry relative to the past. And we're also going to be trying to create a shift share IV. And I don't want to get too much into the details right here, but what we're going to be exploiting is the arrival of breakthrough technologies in upstream technology classes that tend to percolate in downstream technology classes that tend to be more labor saving for a particular task. OK, I don't have a lot of time, but these are just examples of what are some of the main technologies that we're able to identify. This is with the help of clustering methods and LLM. And what here you're going to see is that which technologies matter most for exposure, for worker exposure, that's the blue part, is different than how frequent they are in terms of patenting, but also they vary by decade. I hope you can read that. I don't know. I actually have a hard time reading it from here, so maybe I'll skip that. The second fact that you might want to notice is that if I look at how technology affects the tasks that different workers perform, for the vast majority of the sample, you see that manual tasks tend to be, on average, more exposed to technology. However, that trend has started to change since the ICT. Okay, so we see cognitive tasks being increasingly more exposed. Okay, so after a lot of data work, here's the main regression in the paper. We create estimates of employment in a particular job, in a particular industry, in a particular decade. And we run regressions of that on our exposure measures. The OLS, I'm just showing you the IV estimates right here using my shift share. And then what you're seeing here is that if I look at the mean exposure of occupations to labor demand, there's a negative effect on employment going forward. That effect is pretty slow moving. So if here I stopped at 20 years, but the magnitudes increase down the line, but of course you quickly run out of periods. More interestingly, the second row shows you that the degree of concentration in task exposure actually has an offsetting effect. Okay, so it's not enough for me to know what is the average exposure for an occupation. I also need to know whether that occupation's that exposure is concentrated in specific tasks or is it uniform across the board. And then there's the last term, which captures industry spillovers. So industries that see a lot of patenting, they also experience an increase in labor demand for that across the board. Okay, so I showed you a model where are these high three forces that interact in how technology shapes labor demand. And we found some supporting evidence in the data. What we're going to do next is twofold. I'm going to try to aggregate these and see what was the impact of technology during this 100-year period. And then I'm going to speculate wildly about AI. So here's the realized employment growth for occupations sorted on occupational attainment. That's what happened in the data. This is the amount that's implied by our estimates. This is the degree of polarization. Orange lines is what's the actual happening in the data. The blue line is what our estimates imply. This is changes in employment on occupations sorted by share of female workers, data, empirical estimates. Okay, so everybody wants to know about AI. So here's the most speculative part of the paper. we're going to have to make a ton of assumptions. So I'm going to assume that AI can substitute for tasks that are cognitive and require less than 5 years of experience. It's very convenient for me. And I have to make assumptions for the fall in the relative price. I'm going to assume that the price of AI is going to fall by the same amount that the price of computers fell during that period. We're going to talk about how much can AI boost labor demand. And I'm going to assume that AI is going to create new products. I'm going to look at new AI patents. I'm going to use estimates of patent to product elasticities from the literature. And I'm going to have to take a stance of what's the elasticity of substitution between AI and labor. So I'm going to have this highly well-estimated parameter that's implied by my estimates in the past. So it's going to be 4.63. And of course, there are no G effects here. So this is all about relative labor demand. OK, so blue is what happened in the past, according to our estimates. This is what we think AI is going to do going forward. OK? So that's educational attainment. So it's going to boost demand for workers with lower levels of education. Here's polarization. Here's what we think it's going to do. So notice that the occupation that's most adversely affected is likely to be clerical and admin workers. And last but not least, female, it's basically going to reverse some of these gains. Just to get a sense of magnitudes, these are annualized growth rates. And I have 10 seconds to finish, so that's it. The point of the paper is that just because an occupation is exposed to technology does not need to imply a decline in labor demand. And we think that technology played a role in relative labor demand over the last century, and possibly AI will too. Thank you.
And our first discussant is William Kerr.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for having me down for this. I feel like I got the buy one, get one free, or buy one, get like two free in terms of paper discussions, because this is like a beast of a paper. It's very potent. I don't know how with 15 minutes you even began to kind of unpack it, but there's a lot in it, ranging from a theoretical model to the empirical side, quantitative, and what I'm going to pick on a little bit later. Didn't even mention the large-scale data work that went into constructing this stuff. And ultimately, the near-term application. So very important piece of work, and I learned a lot from it, and I hope that everyone takes a chance to dive into it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend just a few minutes on kind of what I think is like my dutiful notes, a few kind of questions I want to leave with the paper, and then I want to spend more time thinking about where I'm kind of currently sitting in terms of thinking about tasks and occupations that goes beyond just the scope of this piece of work itself. So one thing that was not mentioned is that this is probably maybe the most innovative part of this paper is the very frontier work that's done with large language models to go through the 1800s and 1900s, developing what different occupations would have been doing decade by decade, looking at patterns, mapping that into tasks, then using NLP techniques to talk about when a task and a pattern is overlapping with the other piece. And these authors are actually among the world's experts in kind of pulling this off. I am going to say I leave the paper a little bit wanting to hear more about how I can validate or think through these metrics. I would not bet my daughter's like college tuition that there's not something underneath these things that would maybe be a worrisome piece where you're using different forms of LLM techniques to kind of bring things together and then relate them to each other. And so whether you're running adversarial models or using economic historians, I would love to just kind of stress test this a little bit more, especially as I think a lot of people may want to pick up and utilize these measures in further research. On the empirical side, there's I think the benefit of this paper is it's very tightly connected to the theory model, and the equations kind of fall out of that. I have maybe one high-level concern on some of the metrics. We didn't go through their construction live here, but there's a fair degree of correlation, decade by decade, in some of these measures. And likewise, the concentration measure and the overall exposure measure are related to each other. And so if we can do a little bit more to unpack some of those functional forms, I think that would be helpful, because they're tending to point in the opposite directions from each other. They're stronger when they're in the presence of each other, and so I want to pack that out. And the last kind of piece, just as kind of a broad thing, is I'd love, and I know the data starts to become an extra layer in kind of this building process, but thinking about the diffusion process, we go from patents into job applications or job counts, and what would be differences across time or industry or so forth as to how that diffusion process may play out. There's a couple I do have comments. What I'd really like to do, though, is kind of at a higher level, and I'm going to use a lot of pictures here, try to think about where I see the task model in occupations working, and then also what are some things that I would love at future points for us to all be considering in this process. So the first I want to recognize is, I think, and it's not surprising given a lot of smart people are using this framework, but tasks actually can work out pretty well for thinking about how automation rolls out into workplaces. Sometimes it's really easy, like the picture of the humanoids on the left-hand side, where they're doing one thing going back and forth. But the one that I find even more interesting is the ones on the right-hand side. That comes from a restaurant kernel that's rolling out across New York City. The idea behind this restaurant is going to have a very minimal human input relative to the machinery that's placed around it. And the founder's been going through and thoughtfully thinking about what are all the tasks that are related to food preparation, but also in terms of giving customers their orders, taking payments, and what can we do to automate or kind of remove from the human input all of these different pieces, and thereby concentrate the remaining work that the people in the restaurant are doing. I think this captures that kind of concept quite well. It's how a lot of entrepreneurs are approaching this related work. Now, there is the question then of and a benefit of this paper is that it actually takes what would otherwise be a random set of, we have a certain number of task A, a certain number of task B, and task C that are in the economy. How do we think about automating those? And it helps us ground this in the work of occupations, and also, I'm sure straightforward to kind of pull off the work of firms and ways to we can take this to the microdata. But we then have to make sure that we think the occupation definitions are capturing the level that we would like to have them to be. And overall, I'm going to say that I think it works pretty well, but it also starts to maybe uncover a first dimension of technology change that would be important for occupations, but we're not capturing. So let's start with retail sales clerks, which is one of the definitions. I think this is the perfect kind of definition. It captures the reallocation that workers can do. We don't have some cataclysmic blockbuster, goes belly up kind of event here, because the people in that sector would have been able, through their skill sets and the labor markets, to find other lines of work pretty well. So that's why I kind of find that would map in well here. One that I have just a question about is the occupation miner. And I'm going to there can be multiple forms of miner, but one potentially relevant and one that we've spent a lot of time talking about is coal miners. And so let me just refine this to coal miners. I can imagine this model doing really well, or this framework doing well, at looking at the tasks that a coal miner does in his or her work every day, what's making that more or less productive. But a lot of this occupation's fate is going to sit in the technology improvements that happen in other sectors. You have to think about that you're going to have some kind of industry alignment or cross-connection in order to capture that changes in solar energy will significantly potentially impact what's the future of the coal miner in this space. So that's one, just recognize that once we go beyond the immediate work that Bill Kerr is doing in his job into thinking about the relative demand in other sectors that would impact me directly, we need to consider these things. Now, I want to next pick up on the concentration side. And I like the concentration element a lot, but I want to add in a few other forms of concentration that we might see related to technology, and maybe we can find ways in future work to think about them as well. So the first is, and I often tell exec ed audiences, this is my favorite technology graph. In a world where you have generative AI doing all kinds of crazy stuff, this brings us back home and talks about significant labor-saving opportunities within an industry. So the little box you see on the inset is an MRI machine, very expensive piece of capital equipment. Where you see that black box right in the keyboard used to be kind of like a joystick. You kind of push it forward and back as the patient goes into the facility and out. Now, what the company, the startup, did was it thought specifically about the tasks that were involved in this, and it said, guess what? We can make a black box that we're going to put where that joystick used to be. We'll put in some data feeds and some cameras, and next thing you know, this lady, who's pictured in the bigger picture, is running that machine remotely. And she could be 5 miles away, she could be 5,000 miles away. It doesn't really matter, except, of course, it would matter for wage rates and a whole bunch of other stuff, but it doesn't really matter in terms of the operation of the machine. What's even more significant, though, is why do this? There was a lot of downtime in how that machine functioned, what the person was doing at the task. And so if you look closely, it's hard to see, but if you look closely at her monitor, she's running 4 of these machines at the same time because she can toggle back and forth between the various patients and get rid of, through a new form of concentration, some of that sort of wasted time, less productive time that was happening before. And so there's some ways that this technology is going to reshape distances. And when you look at telemedicine and a bunch of other sort of related tasks, I think you're going to see ever more of this kind of rolling out and building from here. A couple of other kind of few pieces. You think about the incentives of entrepreneurs and businesses to close the loop. I think that's also something that once we start having measures of concentration, we start to say, well, what can we do for this next step? If you show a room full of leaders this set of slides that come from the warehouse, and you ask them what happens next, they're going to start pointing to the person who's in the bottom right-hand corner and saying, we're probably going to try to find some way to think about what that person's work can be done also through automation. Because once you can close the loop, then you could do different things like move the facility to different locations or have different configurations and so forth. And so this strategic incentive is a very important part of how to build that out. And I think the model's starting to make some headway towards what level of concentration would be good, and at what point maybe it can tip over and say this is the final piece. And last, and this is at some level the most speculative, but I think it's also a place where empiricists can do a lot with this. We've seen occupational titles be used in innovative ways in times past. Jeff Lynn has some great work where he looks at what's the role of diversity in cities for coming up with new ideas by looking at where do new occupation titles get born. And I think if I think about this piece, you could say that could be some, take the concentration, which I believe, take that seriously. What is going to be the reconfiguration of occupations around that technology landscape? And is there ways that we could learn in the data about this? So some of you may have read the book Prediction Machines by Josh and Ajay and Avi up in Toronto. It talks about the school bus driver. And it kind of raises this task-based view of the world that says, in a world of self-driving cars, it's not that you're going to want to get rid of the school bus driver, as it stands, because you need someone to protect the kids from outsiders or to protect the kids from each other or other kinds. So you're going to have somebody still on the proverbial bus. I won't get into all the other things you could do on the school bus, like we're just going to protect the kids. But you're not going to have that person just sit there. So you're going to have the person start doing something else. And it could be something like teaching or something like that, so maybe it folds. I look at the world of dental hygienists, and I wonder whether what we're seeing is the emergence of new occupations around various reconfigurations of technology to take advantage of that concentration. And I think you actually have all the data of the changes of these things over time to perhaps bring some of these to the forefront. Now let me just say a couple words on the labor impacts. There's some great work that was done in Sweden. We're trying to extend this to the United States in various ways. There is a labor market impact for being in a declining occupation, which is part of what this paper is grabbing here. It's helpful in this kind of setting to just put the numbers on the table. So across the 86 to 2013 period, if you were in an occupation that's going to decline by 25% in Sweden, you had about 5% lower earnings over that subsequent era. And that's obviously trying to condition everything under the sun and make this as rigorous as possible. So it's something that it's not cataclysmic to a person's life, but it's also a measurable, important thing that would be significant to bear out. And a lot of us are trying to work on other ways to extend this and look at intergenerational shifts. So in my final minute or so, I want to go also to the AI, and I want to wildly speculate about the AI, but I'm going to try to do it in the exact opposite direction of the authors. And I want to go back to like the one difference that I would bring into that question about who's going to be impacted from AI. This was from Michael Webb's job market paper 5-7 years ago, which was one of the first papers that mapped patent tasks to occupations. And so you have higher wage workers on the right-hand side, lower wage workers on the left-hand side, and he was labeling 3 technological waves that went through and where they were having their greatest impact in terms of the task distribution. And so robots was kind of first to the scene, did a lot of stuff in agricultural, mechanical, and manufacturing and so forth. Computers was in the second part with the polarization, and AI was in the third. If you just look at the AI part of this, I'm actually kind of fully on board with your direction of this is going to be mostly impacting higher wage occupations and more educated roles. I think, though, a lot of the action right now seems to be the effort to combine AI with robotics. And once you do that and you look across this distribution, it becomes very hard for me to pin down where exactly this is going to be impacting the work. And at one level, just to kind of map a very simple view of how the technology landscape may have been evolving, you can go back and say some of our very first efforts were in routine manual work, a la the agriculture and manufacturing. We then went through the era of the computer and routine cognitive work. We've been up in the era where we're starting to learn all the impacts that come from non-routine cognitive work. But once you combine robotics with the AI, you get into non-routine manual work. And that, I think, reopens up that across the occupational distribution, it could be significant. And there's a place where, as a final word, I think we should all be very humble. I don't think if we had gone back and had this conference in the year 2000 and hypothesized what was going to be the big impact in the labor market from the internet and the mobile phone colliding with each other, we would have picked out ride sharing. So these things take a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of things figuring out and build it from there. So I appreciate the chance to look at this paper. I think it does a lot of really important work for thinking about task change at the person level, and hopefully my comments also framed we need more work to think about the broader level, how these things stack up with each other.
Second discussant is Christina Patterson.
Great. Well, thank you again so much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this rich and ambitious paper. So as they said, the question at the heart of this paper is technology going to come along, automate tasks, and decrease the demand for labor? I think is almost as old as economics itself. So I went back and I found this quote here from 1820. It's Ricardo, the champion of free trade, comparative advantage, and he sat there worrying that machines were going to hurt workers. A century later, Keynes basically said a very similar thing, warning us all of impending technological unemployment in response to the technologies of the day. And here we are, another century later, with the same anxiety. And so this is an old question, and as a result, it has a very large literature that has attempted to answer it across an array of frameworks. So this includes the large literature on skill-biased technological change, the idea that these technologies kind of disproportionately were complementary to high-skill work. This has been really important for our understanding of the rise of wage inequality. It's been been studied in the kind of framework of capital skill complementarity, and then more recently, these task-based frameworks, which thinks of jobs as bundles of tasks, some of which are routine and automatable, some of which are complex and hard to codify. And this has been important for understanding the effect the impact of job polarization, which was this hollowing out of the middle, as opposed to this uniform shift across the skill distribution. So what do I take from all of this? Well, I sort of took that the question is kind of no longer, does technology have an effect on labor demand, relative labor demand? I think we have a lot of evidence across these waves that it does, but really it's how those effects are operating and what knowing that can tell us about the future impacts of new technologies. And that's where I see this paper coming in. It's in this task-based framework lineage, but it's seeking to kind of unpack this black box of technological change and use the combination of the model and the empirics to shed light on kind of the mechanisms through which which technology is affecting the labor market. It does so with this huge amount of historical data and this new framework. There's a ton in this paper. As I said, it's ambitious, and it's pretty exciting. So since I said I think kind of the most novel piece here is really trying to help us understand the mechanisms through which technology affects labor, I want to kind of zoom in on understanding those mechanisms today. So I'm not going to summarize the whole paper as the second discussant here, but I'll just highlight again for us that there are these three channels through which they think technology can affect labor demand. The first is this average task exposure, so it's just the average exposure of each of your tasks to these new technologies. In theory, this could be either labor substituting or labor augmenting tasks. It could be like the typewriter for an author, could be the loom for a weaver. In reality, it's really, they find that this term is big and negative, so it's really these kind of labor substituting tasks. But then, as they explained, there are these kind of other two offsetting tasks. One comes from this concentration of task exposure, where if one of your tasks is very effective, affected workers can reallocate. And the other are kind of the productivity spillovers that come from these innovations. So today, I think that's very elegant. It kind of gives us this model that really guides our interpretation of the empirics, and I want to kind of zoom in on exactly that link. So let me talk first about the interpretation of this concentration term. So as I said, this is really all about reallocation potential. I think he explained this very well. If technology hits just a few of the tasks within your occupation, workers can endogenously reallocate to these other tasks. And if I introspect, I think that the reallocation of workers across tasks is a very important part of the story of how technology has affected the labor market. I'm not 100% convinced yet that that's actually what's being captured in this particular empirical moment. And I say that because in the model, the concentration term is the weighted variance of task exposure across the tasks in your industry, where the weight is the importance of that task in your occupation. But in the data, it's the unweighted variance of this across your tasks. And what I think that brings up is the question of what is a task? And so we didn't go into the details of this, but how do they get the task? Well, they asked an LLM or ChatGPT to tell them what each occupation did in each decade. And ChatGPT comes back and gives you an average of around 14 tasks for a given occupation. So let me bring you on a journey of what that looks like here. So I asked ChatGPT, what does a telephone operator, I used the prompt that they gave us in the appendix, what does a telephone operator do in 1920? And what it did was it gave me this list, in this case 12 tasks, and it was things like plugging in the cord, answering the calls, watching the lights, ringing subscribers, unplugging the cords, things like that. And on the one hand, that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, it made me think that many of these tasks really look like fragments of a core task, which is kind of manually collecting and managing these calls. And I think this is probably a more general feature of this methodology, which is that ChatGPT has very little discipline on task aggregation. And what that's going to mean is that core tasks tend to get split up into many tasks within this methodology. So, I can't show that that's uniformly happening, but I played around with it. And for example, you get the same number of tasks for a toll booth operator as you do for a dentist or a doctor. And what that means, why I'm mentioning this, is I think that means that technologies that come along and affect the core task in an occupation are going to look like low concentration. And therefore, concentrated exposure likely correlates with the exposure being in a peripheral task. So to give you a sense of that, let's go back to telephone operators here. They were very exposed to this automatic exchange. And when you ask ChatGPT, I don't have their patent language or whatever, we just use the poor man's version of that and say, which of these tasks were affected by this technology? It kind of says that all of these tasks that are kind of this core task were the ones that were particularly exposed. Here, it looks like it's sort of diffuse, but actually it's kind of this one core task that's very affected. So why do I mention this? Why do I think it's potentially important? Well, it sort of changes some of our interpretation here. The model's interpretation is that this worker reallocation across tasks has been a meaningful and offsetting force over the past several centuries. And I think, there's an alternative interpretation, which we kind of can't yet rule out here, which is that maybe the smaller employment losses just happen when the core tasks aren't that affected. And this sort of matters, it's important to distinguish when we extrapolate to these AI scenarios, which may affect core tasks or not, and how much we think the past is telling us about reallocation could really depend on how we interpret these. So one suggestion, maybe that's helpful, is maybe we can just lean into the whole spirit of this exercise, and we could just ask the LLM to give us the weights on these tasks. That would kind of bring the empirical measure right back in line with the interpretation in the model. So I did that using ChatGPT-5 here, and it sort of correctly, I think, kind of got the idea that most of this occupation was really in this task. And had we had these weights, we would have found that this exposure was incredibly large and quite kind of concentrated in these tasks. Okay, in the last couple minutes, I just want to move to the kind of thinking about unpacking this last term, which is this industry spillover term. And if you remember from the presentation, the table that was flashed, this term is really big. And it's kind of a big offsetting force here. So I want to think a little bit more about what's included here. So in the model, as Dimitri explained, there are kind of two sources of these spillovers, and I think they're conceptually a bit distinct. One is the spillovers that come from these labor-saving technologies. If we think about what's the effect of automation, this is the spillover that comes from automation, either directly, because it's substituted for the task and it's more productive, or indirectly through kind of the reallocation. And then there's this other term, which is just these TFP shocks that happen to the industry. So in the data, they capture this by using a different set of patents than the ones that are linked to task. It's all of the patents that are linked to an industry. So let's think about that in the case of our telephone operators. So telephone operators were obviously very directly exposed to this automatic telephone exchange system. There's some recent evidence in the QG that in the year after the adoption of this exchange system, employment in this occupation dropped by 50 to 80%. So that was pretty severe. However, there were many concurrent technological innovations in the telecom sector. This is things like long-distance repeaters that increased call volume, multiplexing that increased the possibility for local calls, nice headsets that made phones look good in homes. And all of these kind of increased the demand for the telephone sector. And all of these spillovers are kind of included in this industry spillover term. So why do I think this is important? Well, again, as we think about what this empirical work tells us about the mechanisms through which technology has affected labor demand, I think it could be important to kind of keep in mind that there are these two terms here. This really isn't just kind of the spillover from automation. And I think this matters, again, when we think about extrapolating to AI. If we think that this big offsetting term is coming mostly through these spillovers, then even these kind of labor-saving technologies could lead to an increase in labor demand. If instead it's these kind of exogenous TFP things like the innovations in the telecoms industry that happen to coincide with these labor replacing technologies, then our kind of extrapolation to other technologies might look quite different. And I think there's actually some scope here, given the richness of the data, to kind of try to tease out these two by kind of using breaking up that industry exposure term even more to kind of help us understand the mechanism. And then lastly, as I thought about this spillover term, I just want to mention here, since it applies uniformly to all occupations within the industry, I think it actually potentially masks some of the very polarization that the authors are looking to explore. And if you think of the case of the telecommunications industry, right, something like the increase in the volume of long-distance calling or the capacity for long-distance calling created a big boom in the industry for linemen and engineer, and it probably had no offsetting effect for the telephone operators who were completely, no longer involved in local calls after the adoption of this technology. And so I think finding a way to kind of think about this would actually really strengthen the author's arguments that these technologies were really a key driver behind job polarization. Okay, with that, I'll conclude. As I said, I think this is a very ambitious paper that really helps us try to understand the mechanisms through which technology affects labor demand. And I know it's beyond the scope of this, but I can't resist just mentioning, I think kind of the next key step here is to go from looking at the effect on jobs, which is the focus of this paper, to the effect on workers. And I know they're working on this in follow-up work, but just to kind of keep that in mind as we think about what this paper is informing about the labor market. So thanks very much.
All right, let's open it up for questions. John Haltwanger.
So very interesting paper and discussion. Really two comments. One concept I didn't see in the paper or in the discussion is something that David Otter has been really emphasizing lately, is the concept of expertise. And it's the idea that to figure out this, we really need to think about if there are some occupations that get displaced, displaced, the question is of the remaining tasks, do they require expertise or not? And I was wondering whether, does your framework capture this in any way, shape, or form? So I'll say a very different comment is, and you talk about this in the paper, is using patents as strengths and weaknesses as a way to track innovation. We know that works very well in some sectors and not so well in other sectors. I think it works well in often some of the key high-tech sectors. It doesn't work so well in sectors like retail trade, for example. So, but even in retail trade, we know for patents that have revolutionized retail trade, there's a really complex and long lag relationship. So I looked up, the barcode was invented in 1952, okay? And it turns out it took decades, of course, before it completely revolutionized the retail trade sector in all kinds of dimensions, not just you were using scanner technology, but it led to the mega retail chains like Amazon but also Walmart and the like. So, and this is decades later, and I wonder about in terms of sort of those very long lags between here's this barcode that turns out to be vitally important for the revitalization of retail trade. It's 30 years later that this kicks in, and I don't know how the framework picks that up.
Catherine?
Just to pick up on what John was just saying, I had some of the same questions about how to think about the lags that are embedded in the modeling. The baseline specifications in the paper look at effects over 10 years or 20 years. There's some estimates reported that go out at 50 years. As John was just saying, there's a lot of technological innovations that take a very long time to diffuse out into actually affecting how work is done. John was thinking about barcodes. I was thinking about factory electrification, which took many decades. And I'm thinking about how that relates to translating these results into predictions about what's going to happen with AI. I mean, a lot of these earlier innovations took a lot of investment in order to actually implement them. And it's not really clear that if firms are looking to adopt AI in their processes, that the same kind of investment is needed. And that could imply that the adoption is faster. And I think that's relevant to thinking about employment effects, or effects, to pick up on Christina's comment, effects on workers, in that if change happens rapidly, it's likely to be much more disruptive for the people who are affected. And I don't know quite how to, in that sense, translate your results into how we should think about the likely effects of AI. Just one other quick comment. I would echo William's remark about wanting to stress test some of the estimates for the earlier years. The paper talks about validating the assignment of tasks to occupations for 1940, 1970, years when there are Dictionary of Occupational Title data or ONET data. In the earlier years, that didn't exist, and I wonder if one way to stress test the earlier estimates would be to say, look at 1940 and tell the LLM, and by the way, don't look at the DOT or don't look at the that in the later years the ONET information. I don't know if it would listen, but it might be a way to see how well you could do without that information.
Penny?
I have a specific question, actually. In the graphs you showed, the model predictions tend to go in the same direction as the actual data, but they always understate the total effect. And so I'm wondering what the source of this understatement is, and Christina's comments made me wonder whether it's the lack of these weights on how various tasks are affected by the technology, if this would actually do the trick of scaling up your estimates. And I'm thinking that because if I understood Christina's comments correctly, with the current approach where every task is given the same weight, you tend to, so the second channel tends to play a very important role in mitigating the labor substitution effect. And my takeaway from the graphs is ultimately the labor substitution effect dominates.
So we have a question from Carolyn Hawksby that Jan is going to read for us.
Yeah, Carolyn sent in a Q&A with a question about, that is Carolyn Hawksby, that on your AI exercise. So this is related to Catherine's point about the investment in AI. And she points out the importance of training data for rolling out AI, and that would be differentially available in different occupations, different tasks. And so you might be able to utilize the differences in availability of training data, say, between cutting-edge research versus, millions of X-rays that are available that could be used to train AIs, and that might refine your AI exercise. So that's Carolyn's suggestion.
Michelle?
Yes, so I was surprised by your prediction that demand for female labor will go down. So women work predominantly in high-contact occupations like teachers, nurses, childcare workers that seem to me at least, very hard to replace with technology. So I was wondering if this is perhaps also related to Christina's comments on sort of these missing weights, because I'm sure childcare workers also do some documentation, and that can be replaced with AI, but that's probably a very small part of their hours. Thank you.
Adrian?
Very interesting paper. So I have a question about the missing intercept. So you mentioned that you can only give, in the context of your model at the moment, the effect of technology on relative labor demand. But it seemed to me you have a fully specified model of labor demand. And so what stops you from specifying the labor supply side of the model, making some assumptions about, say, labor supply elasticities, and then using that to get the aggregate effect of technology on the labor market?
Okay, let's hand it to the authors for a little while, and then we might just come back and have a second round. But why don't you take a shot at these questions?
All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate all the comments, and thanks for two fantastic discussions. We're obviously trying to do a lot in this paper, so there's many places one can be both excited by what we're doing and maybe want to probe things further. So we appreciate all those. So just a couple of specific comments that we got is, first, there was some questions we got about kind of the exposure measures and the extent to which these kind of the weights on the tasks, or how much that was driving what we have, and also whether kind of time variation in our task descriptions is really important. And our perspective on this is the LLM is an amazing technology. It's far better than anything we had before. We're all collectively as a profession trying to figure out ways of stress testing that. So sometimes we have really nice validation data available. Obviously, when we have validation data available, it works. At the same time, it's you can kind of look at lots of examples. The examples seem kind of reasonable. We can't really get weights, and especially with the older versions of LLMs, it was kind of hard to get them to give you numerical answers that made any sense. They'll give you 8 out of 10 basically every time when you ask them for those kinds of questions. And likewise, we would love to look at changes in those task descriptions over time, but it's really hard to do this. Like that then is really leveraging what ChatGPT is trying to do to interpolate between all the data that it sees. And so we were pretty hesitant to do that for this project. So I will say that what's most important is that we have kind of ordinal information that's right. And I think in that sense, one way of just defining an occupation consistently over time is it's sort of a consistent partition of, at a very high level, the tasks that workers do. And so in that sense, I think what we end up with is pretty kind of stable. And to Christina's point about how often it will take a core task and split it into many pieces, in some sense that's good for us because that ends up through the back door giving us a weight. If you have like a number of tasks that look very similar, they would all be exposed to the same technology. That will end up producing statistics for mean and concentration that will look kind of like the weighted versions that we're after. So there's a potential that kind of solves the problem for us in the back door, but your points are very well taken. You also asked a question about the correlation structure between these, and I think this is an insight that we often forget when we think about exposure to technologies. Often there's this, David Otter often describes this as if you're exposed, you're hosed sort of perspective on technological exposure. And on the one hand, that's true. We provide direct evidence that if on average a lot of your tasks are exposed, this is bad for you as a worker. But it's typically the case that technology can't do everything that a worker can do. So when the mean exposure is high, the concentration measure is also typically high, and that's kind of natural. Moreover, if we think about these other offsetting effects like the spillovers, those typically, the only way to be exposed directly is also to typically be in an industry in which there's a lot of technological progress. And so you're the same people who are exposed on the downside to the substitution forces, to seeing their tasks being eliminated by new technologies like AI or mechanization, et cetera, are also the people who typically are going to benefit the most from these spillovers. And it's rarely the case that the technology can do everything that the workers can do. I think that's part of also why these effects take so long, is you have to, the barcode is, there's an initial patent coming up with it, but then we're going to, over time, refine that technology. And so technologies are sequences of many, many patents that come out over time, which is part of why, these effects typically grow with the horizon. It's like the epsilon, the task price improvement is a lot lower over a 10-year horizon than after we've had, 50 years to figure these things out. So, that is one insight we saw, especially with AI, where we have much more detailed and granular data. And some of what we're doing here is building on our earlier work, thinking about the AI episode, is really that these spillover forces, even in a model where you hardwire really strong substitution, these spillovers can be very strong. And in fact, with the first wave of AI, so-called predictive AI, it looks like they were enough to completely offset the direct displacement effects. So I think that insight is often lost in our discussion of, these apocalypses that are coming in the labor market from technologies.
Great. So I need to add a few things here. So the first thing is, I think... Oh, okay, sorry. I just want to add a few things here. So one of the limitations of the current framework is that because of the CS structure, everything is sort of flat. So one interesting extension we're exploring is to have a network structure both at the industry but also at the occupation level. So then you can have certain occupations, their output fitting into as an input into other occupations. And then I think you can have a lot of the effects that Christina was saying, where some of these industry spillovers are no longer flat at the occupational level, but there are, they have differential effects. So that's number one. Number two, on new tasks, and that's I think the task-based framework is beautiful in its simplicity. When you start thinking about what it actually means and how you take into the data, there's a lot of complications that arise. And I think the main thing is that how narrowly do you define a task? You can have a very micro view of a task where, it's like I write the introduction to the paper, I run the regression in Stata, I do this, I do that. Or it can have a more macro view of the task where I do research. And once, if you want to take it to the data, you have to make some choices. So that's something that's both conceptually complicated, but also just the logistics of it you have to think a little bit about. Now, in that said, I think a big question that's not answered in this literature at all is why are tasks bundled together in certain jobs? And if you want to think about new tasks, it helps you think about where are these new tasks going to arise. Is it going to be in the existing jobs? Is it going to be new workers that do these? And the dynamics of that over time. I think it's a super interesting question that we're thinking about going forward. On the weights, Christina is absolutely right. ChatGPT 5 seems to be, at least on that one example, better than the version that we used back in January. That said, we have this other paper that kind of builds on the same framework, or rather this framework builds on that paper, and there we were using ONIT weights. And again, to the extent that you believe that the ONIT tasks are an accurate description of what workers do, and again, and those weights are somehow representative, we actually found similar estimates for the concentration term. So it seems to be capturing something there. On Adrian's point about what stops us from doing GE, In the model, nothing, time, and whether we're willing to make assumptions on labor supply elasticity. We think this deserves another paper where, otherwise the paper would sort of be 10 times the current limit. On AI, and Caroline's question, I think one of the difficulty that with these counterfactuals, and this touches on what Bill said as well, is what exactly do we mean by when we talk about AI? Because I think we all read different science fiction books, so we all have a very different concept of what AI can do. Is it going to be a fancy autocomplete, or is it going to be this robot that speaks and talks like a human person? So we had to we made some assumptions. We said, under these conditions, you can think about this framework as if you think AI is going to do this, then this is what we think is going to happen on relative labor demand. I'm not willing to bet my son's tuition on any of these assumptions, but I do think that the same forces we uncover are likely going to be in play there as well. Now, and if you have a different view of what AI can do in 10 years, you can make a completely different set of assumptions. I do agree that training, if we had information about which tasks require training data, actually Larry Summers tweeted a few days ago that OpenAI has this new evaluation tool about how good ChatGPT is performing real-world tasks. I think going forward, we're going to have more of these data, and then one can think more about these counterfactuals. On John's point about patents and technology, absolutely. Patents don't measure all innovation. We're very open to alternatives. So yes, diffusion is also an issue. All these things have issues. I'm completely open to thinking about new sources of data that measure technological progress. In other work, I've tried to think about 10Ks or earnings calls. Firms are very imprecise in what they disclose. Might suspect that the advances in large language models is going to allow economic historians to dig through more sources of data, and then we can do more interesting things going forward. We're completely open to suggestions. On external validation, that's a problem when you're having, if we could validate it using some other data, then we would not have to create this task to begin with. We did try to tell ChatGPT to not do X. It often gaslights you and tells you it didn't do it. But I haven't figured out a way exactly how to get alignment. The last thing in this paper, I think a lot of the spillovers happen at the firm level. At least that's what our other paper and I showed. And we really had no information on firms here. So I think that's a big missing part of this exercise. And I think that's partly why our spillovers are somewhat attenuated.
And that also kind of relates to Caroline's comment about the availability of training data. Is one thing we know about AI adoption in the data that we have is that it's super biased to large firms. There's some fixed cost component to figuring this out, and so what is nice about recent periods is we get better data, and so we can do a lot better measurement. And so just like for AI, we actually in this other paper we're working on, we don't think that patents are necessarily the right corpus of text there. In fact, because a lot of the great applications of AI aren't patentable at all. And so you actually want to go to alternative sources of data. And so there we do, and we look at the LinkedIn profiles of kind of all the workers in the US. And so you can basically, by reading that source of text, you can get incredible granularity in terms of who's doing what with AI. And so we definitely see there that these firm-level spillovers are quite large. And so again, that partially insulates workers against the adverse effects of AI, because to be directly exposed to displacement from AI, you're also going to be at a firm that's doing all of this new stuff with AI. That firm is going to grow. They're going to steal market share from their competitors who aren't adopting AI, and they're going to, so that the market share of that occupation within the firm shrinks, but the firm grows a lot. And these two forces are kind of, they look like, at least with the wave of AI, up to generative AI, that those two things offset. So these spillover terms we think are quite large, and I do just feel like in our discussions of what these technologies will do to everyone, we often neglect them.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up or a reiteration of Michelle's question, if you could address that and whether it's because of the types of cognitive skills that where women are concentrated. And then secondly, I think you answered my second question because I heard a presentation this summer, which I think was also yours, that was more optimistic about the spillovers. And I was trying to remember whether it was the job spillovers or the firm spillovers. And so maybe you could just articulate that a bit more. But I think that somebody else had a question too.
Tarek?
So I just wanted to back up the authors that in general, I think we have very little reason to believe that the large language models are going to spit out any numbers that you should put any weight on, because it's a large language model, and unless at some point OpenAI explains to us why all of a sudden it's supposed to be able to do math, I think we should not let it do math.
David.
While we're following up on questions on the doing general equilibrium, I have a suggestion that would make life easier, which is just assume flat labor supply curves everywhere, and then you're just getting, rather than shifts in relative demand, you're getting shifts in total labor demand. I don't know. I suspect it's harder than I think, so maybe that's the next paper, but I think that really is the question people want. You don't have to model labor supply, so it's sort of halfway to general equilibrium. That's just a suggestion about going further with this.
I'm going to take my prerogative as an editor to respond to that, because I played some role in them downplaying this, and my perspective was that the benchmark should be balanced growth preferences, and so there would be no effects on labor supply in the aggregate. And I pushed them to articulate why their model was getting anything other than that, and I think it's not easy to know. Tatiana.
I'm curious how your model and your empirical work handles new occupations. So software engineer, not something that existed 100 years ago, was made possible with new technology, and potentially there might be new occupations that are enabled with AI as well. And I'm curious if that's a clearly missing piece or if there's something that implicitly captures those kinds of dynamics.
Gerald.
So I have a corollary to John's question. And if I think about problems that I have when I call a call center, it's that there's a lack of judgment and that you always end up asking for a supervisor who, and it doesn't necessarily mean expertise, although that helps, but there's really this question of somebody needs to make a judgment call on something where there's uncertainty about how to read the manual, or how to do your taxes, or how your plumber looks at the broken pipe, or all of these things that involve judgment. So I'm wondering, is there a way of incorporating that into the data that you're looking at, or the tasks that you're looking at to think about, because those seem much harder to replicate.
Okay, back to the others.
Do you want to go? Sure. Okay. Sorry, on the G point again, it's not just aggregate labor supply that we need to take a stance on the model. It's also the spillovers that happen from the industry level to the aggregate. And again, that's where I think a network would make more sense. We can certainly make a lot of assumptions. There's going to be nothing in the empirical estimates that disciplines this, because all our specifications are going to be comparing more relative to less exposed occupations at a point in time. So we can certainly do this. I think it's going to require even more heroic assumptions to what we did, and it's going to require a lot more space for us to do this. So we're certainly interested in doing this. We don't think that this is the right format for this particular project, but we're fully on board that that's an interesting question. Is there going to be any work left for me in 10 years? Completely agree with this. Now, on Michelle's question, sorry, I missed that. I think a lot of the decline in is because a lot of women are concentrated in white-collar clerical admin jobs, and these are projected to experience a large decline. So I think that's partly what's driving our estimates. And again, you should take this with a big grain of salt, and I think a lot of it has to do with when people say AI, what exactly are you envisioning? Are you envisioning HAL, the computer from Space Odyssey, or is it like just a sophisticated telephone automated system? Now, going back to your point, I do think that, again, this goes back to the discussion, what do we think AI can do? I think right now a big issue is validation, right? We ask ChatGPT a question, it spits out an answer, it sort of looks correct, but you wouldn't exactly bet your life on it. There's going to be some demand for workers, potentially routine workers, to validate the output of AI, at least in the short run. So I think that could create, this is an example of a sort of a new task that might arise. And as I was saying earlier, I don't think we have a good theoretical framework to think about who's going to be doing these new tasks.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So the assignment of workers to these new tasks is definitely still an open question. I would say that within the framework we've had a lot of fun kind of playing with these CES intercepts. And something you kind of learn when you do that is that each of these pieces can be micro-founded using kind of a richer model. So just as a simple example, we talked about there's sort of a weight on industries in that CES nest, and that you can micro-found explicitly using like a Romer model with multiple varieties, and that has the interpretation of an increase in the number of product varieties. And likewise, if we create new small occupations, kind of micro-occupations in the language of Lynn or recent work by David Otter and Anna Salomons and Brian and Carolyn Chin, I think I got them all, that can also show up as a shift in one of these CES parameters. And so in principle, we could do this. The challenge is then, of course, going to be how we measure all this stuff. And I think in recent data, we have more hope of kind of carefully measuring the emergence of these new tasks and who does them. And kind of related to expertise as well, something that we saw in previous work is that it's not clear that all new technologies are a direct substitute for human labor. In fact, in the kind of post-1980s period, we thought about non-routine related innovations, and there we see that those are associated with increases in labor demand, typically. So there's a rise in employment, there's a rise in the wage bill for exposed occupations, and yet if you take the perspective of incumbent workers, especially better educated, older, higher paid workers within those occupations, it does look like those workers are displaced in the sense that you will see declines in their earnings going forward. And so, one of the things that technological change can do, even in contexts where it's less clear that there's direct substitution happening between the machine and the worker, there can be substitution between new workers and old workers. And that actually is something that creates a lot of redistribution across workers. That's something we're very interested in. So we're hoping to dive in further on that, especially with the AI episode. So all these things are interesting. The closest we get to that in the paper is something Dimitri's didn't talk at all, which is we can look at variation across cohorts. So you can ask, is it the case that all of this is happening on the entry margin? Maybe that's the most benign way in which technological change could impact the labor market, is just people who would have entered this occupation go somewhere else. And it doesn't look like that. In fact, if the entrants seem about as elastic as cohorts of kind of typical workers, what we do see is that these concentration effects are actually most pronounced among younger workers. So it's like the younger cohorts, their employment is most responsive to whether there's kind of opportunities to go to tasks that aren't affected or not. And so that's kind of interesting and maybe consistent with the idea that they are the ones who are willing to acquire the new expertise you need to do the new stuff. But again, we have repeated cross-section data, so we're limited in what we can say throughout the whole historical sample.
In this project?
In this project, yes.
Okay, well, let's thank the authors and the discussants for a lively session.